So this talk started life as something about supply chains and logistics and all the things that are associated with that. And then on Tuesday, we found out that we'd actually got a chunk of money from Nesta to do some research kind of in this area a bit. So in a way, so the talk kind of morphed into an unusual shape. So as part a talk and part a soft launch for some stuff that's going to be happening for the next few months, certainly. So that's the kind of a framing of how this thing, like a big ship covered in shipping containers, will traverse across the sea, possibly of your imagination or not. As part of that soft launch, I'll start off very quickly with this. There's the idea from Chekhov of Chekhov's gun, that one should not necessarily have any object at the start of a narrative that is not going to be picked up later on and used. If there's a gun at the beginning of a play, in the room, it gets picked up and used later. This is Chekhov's IUD, Chekhov's intrauterine device. It will be picked up later, but we're just placing it here in a slightly unseemly way to say this is part of the journey that we're going on. So for a long time, certainly the past few years, it seems that everyone I know has become obsessed with shipping containers. And I never really knew what this was. And even when it started to infiltrate my own imagination, I started thinking about shipping containers and what they could be used for and how and why. I was never quite sure of what the context was, why suddenly there was so much obsession in the popular imagination with shipping containers. And they seem to be everywhere. There's been talk in Brighton Council of shipping containers being used as a site to place homeless people into when there's not enough housing. There's been more talk, I think, in London, actually more seriously, of using shipping containers as a form of alternative housing. There's been a lot of pop-up kind of shops and things that have been using shipping containers as this very small, thin place that you kind of wedge yourself into as you go and look at jeans. And they seem to be everywhere. And I started kind of looking at them. And I set up a kind of a not particularly well-populated Tumblr called Shipping Containers in Popular Culture. I was trying to figure out where they ended up in films. So The Wire Season 2 has shipping containers in it. Very critical plot point. It happens in a shipping yard. The end of Iron Man 3, I think I can say this without spoiling it, but it's in a shipping yard, and there are shipping containers, and it's quite important what happens there as well. But in all of this, there was kind of never quite the question of what, so what. And it started feeding back again and again into what shipping containers did in terms of how they fitted into bigger things around supply chains and logistics. Now, logistics is kind of this very dull way of describing this massively complicated system of trying to pull together all these global supply chains of getting bits from one part of the world to another. Dan Hancock, the journalist, wrote a fantastic article last month called Fuck Your Pop-Up Shop, where he specifically took on the use of a shipping container in these pop-up settings and said, actually look at these things. If you look at them, what these things are is a symbol of mass unemployment. When they came in originally, they completely obliterated, they took out so much employment in the shipping yards, because once you've got one of those and a very large crane, you really don't need so many men to do the work for you anymore. You've just got these things, and that's what they are. And they're getting more advanced in kind of logistics and shipping container technology. Logistics accounts for about 7% of European Union GDP at the moment. It's getting more linked in with online and digital systems so that you can map out and see where various things are around the world, where these ships are moving, how fast they're going as well. The people who work with logistics in this kind of area describe the new agile techniques around shipping containers that they're bringing in, not necessarily agile as in, the speed of the boat, but agile as in the information you're going through. And yet, this whole system seems to be quite invisible. Like as Andrew was saying, it seems this thing, unless it goes wrong, unless it kind of bumps up against, something quite physical, unless it breaks into this world, this kind of unseen infrastructure around supply chains that kind of sorts out our world and makes sense of it, you don't tend to see it. Now, one of the times you did see it was with this case. This is not just a ship having a fun time and going for slight rocking. This is a ship in serious trouble. And this is the Maersk shipping line container ship, the Napoli, that I don't know if any of you remember, but I think back in 2007, when it was traversing between Belgium and Portugal, it was doing a big European tour, it fell into difficulties in the English waters. And the people tried to tow it to safety, they tried to steer it, but eventually it washed up on shore in Devon. And once it did, all the things that were in those containers, all 42,000 tons of stuff, that was in the shipping containers washed up too. And suddenly it was there, this whole world that people hadn't seen, hadn't seen specifically locked up. And it was a completely random mix of stuff on the Napoli. And it was quite quickly stolen as well, because it included things like motorbikes. It had car parks. There were things like nappies and perfume bottles and rum, and all this incredibly random stuff that was suddenly there for the taking, where previously it would have been in quite owned and contained environments as well. Now, there's a research group called Follow the Things that tries to make visible a lot of the stuff around supply chains so that you know where stuff is coming from and where it's going. And one of the tools they've used for this is Lego, to try and make, to help people see what, is an easy path through things. And so, obviously, they built their own Lego version of the Napoli crash, and that is a salvager on the Devon beaches, and that's lots of salvage. And in the background, you can see in the grey and the white, all the various shipping containers that have washed up as well. And there are lots of photos in this series as a way to try and make sense of what this stuff looks like when it's actually out in the world and not just, locked away in a little box that's under someone else's control. And there have been other people as well who have tried to, make sense of this, to try and, see what it looks like. This, I'm sure several of you will have seen already, but it's worth showing again because it's just fantastic. This was the final year project of a student, Thomas Thwaites, who tried to make a toaster from scratch. At the time that he did this, in around 2009, the cost of a toaster in his regular Tesco's was about £3.94. And this seemed to be ridiculous. This was something that, he liked toast. There's a very nice blurb on his website, extolling how nice toast is. But it seemed to be ridiculous that this actually quite clever bit of kit was so bloody cheap. And he thought, well, okay, what happens if I tried to make it? And this is the result. This is what happens where he spent thousands of pounds and months going around disused mines around Britain, kind of hauling the stuff out of the ground to see what he could do with it and what he could make. And that, that's what he's got. And it's not particularly fantastic. And it's clearly not the same advance as, a massive manufacturing company. But the point he was raising was what this massive industrial activity is and how, big and complex and messy it is, and the scale of it, but what it boils down to in trying to shave off the few pence off the price of a toaster, which is already very cheap, just so you can get what he called these kind of additional modicums of comfort as well. Now, the technology of the supply chains also do weird things to kind of how technologies travel through them as well. This is a mining borehole piece of device. It's made by a company that no longer exists just outside of Lewis. And this was some research that we did about 5 or 6 years ago that was looking at user-led design and innovation in the United Kingdom. So not just that manufacturing and design techniques and capabilities would be held within a company, but also how do you learn from users as you're doing it. And a lot of this kind of had treated users up to that point as a very binary system. There's a company, they make things, there are customers, you sell things to them, you learn from that. That's a very simple experience. With these guys, it was much, much more complicated. So what you've got here, firstly, these things are big. They're about kind of yay big or so. They're really bloody expensive. That thing there is probably about £20,000 or so. The price range they had was between 12 and 32,000. They only made 15 types of these bits of kit in their factories. Not even a factory, kind of probably something about the size of this room. This very small but very kitted out manufacturing plant just on the Lewis border. And what this was for people who were doing mining. So people, particularly in Australia, was one of their major markets, in parts of South Africa as well. And what you did, as the MD described it, is, if you're drilling, you never drill a straight hole when you're trying to go mining. You can only drill crooked holes, and then you end up measuring how crooked they are and where you'll end up. So what your people would do was they would take these big bloody instruments and they would drop it down the hole, and it has various clever bits of electronic kit inside it, and it would provide readings to the people up on the surface about kind of the depth, the angle, the azimuth, all these kind of things, so that they wouldn't have to go down there. It was very, very smart and very, very lovely and beautiful thing. But these things, these very, very shiny objects, were made for fairly brutal terrains. What you've got, it's lovely, like I said, it's very expensive for what it is, but it's meant for, it's meant for these really rough and ready environments. There would be the people who, who are manufacturing them, the companies, you want to keep this stuff really, really safe. So you've got the electronics in it is kind of kitted out in a little safe container in there. The ends are specifically welded together. I mean, this is not something that's meant to be modifiable. This is completely a closed and sealed device. You take it, you go mining, you drop it down a hole, it tells you what you need to know for the surface, you know what you should do next. Brilliant. The guys who made them said that these devices only operated in two states. They either worked or they were broken. And you kind of hope they work, but sometimes they broke. And when they broke, that was kind of where things got interesting. Because in its lifetime, the company that made these had got bought out by a parent company who got slightly paranoid that the manufacturers would start dealing with customers directly. So kind of covered all trace of what the company actually did. So they had no website, there was no branding. We found them by, I think, sheer happenstance. We knew someone who played tennis with the MD, and that was how we got into them. But it was kind of this almost stealth mining borehole equipment operation that was running in Sussex. And that kind of fine until the things broke. And then they had to mend them. And because of the way the company was set up, because they weren't allowed direct access to customers, these broken and squished things would be sent back to the manufacturers to try and figure out what the hell had gone wrong. And they said it was this incredible kind of reverse engineering, almost forensic anthropology of these devices. So it would be squished and they would be crunched and they would be, one of the MD said that one looked like it had been shrink wrapped, and they couldn't figure out how that had happened, like what pressure it would take to do that. But because they weren't allowed any contact with the customers, they had to do it all by this kind of trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and also figuring out how they'd been used. When you sell something, you've got an idea of what it's going to be used for, but they would be getting these things back, which again, remember, were not meant to be modified, but that had been soldered, that would have bottle caps put onto them, and they were just like these strange devices that come from some other place. The only time they recalled was where they actually met one of the customers, where this customer had very specifically found their details, bypassed the parent company, and turned up on their doorstep on Boxing Day morning, having travelled from Australia with 6 of these instruments under his arm, just desperate to talk to someone about how they could get mended. But it was all this very kind of stealth kind of operation about what on earth they should be doing. And that's kind of like only a two-step supply chain issue between, the manufacturers, the suppliers, and the actual customers. And already that was causing no end of a nightmare for them for trying to figure out what the hell their instruments were being actually used for. In other supply chains, it gets bigger and it gets much messier. This was a workshop that we ran up at FACT in Liverpool on Valentine's Day, which was a fantastic romantic time of the year to be talking about supply chains. And because it was Valentine's Day, because it was romantic, we decided that we would try and map out a supply chain, but because it was romance, we would map out the supply chain of sex toys and see what they looked like. So we started with the company themselves. We figured out that they're probably UK-based. We decided they would probably outsource their manufacturing capability to somewhere else that knew how to do this. We started thinking about, you've got raw materials in there as well, and then it gets eventually taken back. And we were using the images to do this from Ladybird picture books about work to try and figure out. Ladybird picture books about work are specifically for children. They're not deviant. They don't deal with the type of product that we're talking about here. But can you map the types of job onto it that they're doing? And odds are you can. So we had the people who were laying the telecommunications and the undersea cables, so that you've got all the kind of the communication infrastructure in place to be able to communicate with the factories overseas you're doing your manufacturing with, and also with other parts of your supply chain as well. You've got, in the factory itself, you've got quality control to make sure that things are running properly. We were thinking maybe the factory doesn't just manufacture sex toys, maybe the factory manufactures other things as well. And so, this is just, 3 days a week they do this, but they need to make sure that the machines are running safely for all the time. You've got people receiving orders, call centers, basically. If this is anything like Love Honey, then probably there are people online willing and waiting to take your order. So there are people doing that job. And again, that's probably not the only company that they're going to be working for either. And finally, the product gets delivered. And so we've got the postal service as well, whether it's privatized or nationalized. And we decided that we designed our company name so it would all be delivered in discrete packaging, so discrete that you could deliver it to people who wouldn't even know what it actually was. So, keeping it below the surface. And one of the things that came out of this was how little any of this had to do with kind of almost the deviant nature of the technology that you're talking about here. You've got the MD, the CEO, the person who founds the company, who will be intrinsically associated with the identity of it. But then you've got people probably who are brought in to do maybe a bit of casual web development, set up the website. That might not be the only job they do. So is that how they're working with it? You've got the factory. That, again, might not be the only thing they make. it might not matter what they're making. That might just be the job they're making that day. You've got the people who are providing the raw materials, possibly rare earth minerals as well, to kind of come into that as well. You know, it's just a raw material. We have, again, a shipping container drawn very small there. Again, what's in our factory that goes into a shipping container is going to be one of loads of things. You know, sex toys, motorcycles, perfume bottles, lots of different things all jumbled up together and taken over by the shipping line. At the other end, we had journalists who were probably writing various kind of hack pieces based on our press releases so that they could go out. We had some other bit of marketing and PR as well. We had a shop where it would be sold. So lots and lots of different things. And each of those kind of didn't really necessarily associate with what the actual deviant or socially unusual product was itself, which we ended up describing as with that pink picture there. Everything else just seemed to be, it was a facet of work. It wasn't necessarily associated with what else was going on. And there's kind of this locality of it as well was really peculiar for us as well, thinking about what would we need to keep in Britain and what would we need to outsource. And the history of sugar is really curious and interesting around this, and it's something I've been fascinated by for years and years. Sugar production is incredibly localized and incredibly invisible. If you have any interest in kind of the food you eat, and this particularly in a Brighton context, thinking about supply chains of and provenance and production, sugar is kind of really stealth. It's really sneaky. It was described by, I think, one author of a paper specifically about sugar production as this invisible food. It's really taken for granted. People who would normally be quite careful about whether they would go for organic food or whether they'd go for kind of free-range meat or eggs, for sugar, it doesn't matter so much. It doesn't really have that kind of identity. One of the sugar manufacturers described how sugar was sold like cement in bags, just off the shelf. It's not something that's ever kind of particularly bijou or anything like that at all. So it's this kind of really sneaky product, and it's also got, its history talks about it being used as, an energy source, as a spice, as a medicine. So it's kind of got all these weird different identities that lock in with it as well. And because it's so localized in terms of where it's produced from, that it has really weird knock-on effects in what it does. So Coca-Cola, for years and years, used cane sugar, which grown in hot climates, as part of how it produced its products. In the 80s, corn syrup became more widely available and much, much cheaper, so production shifted to corn syrup use. But in the US, in Mexico, they continued to use cane sugar, which has a slightly different flavor to it. So for a while, if you were living in the southern states of America, you could buy this kind of the Mexican Coke, kind of Coke made with cane sugar, which had this slightly different taste, this slightly novelty thing around it as well. And this was this kind of almost hipster product that you could get. If you were living in Los Angeles, if you were down in San Diego, you could get kind of Mexican Coke brought to you across the border, this brilliant thing. And then in November last year, the Mexican government decided that it was having obesity problems with the Mexican population, and that it was going to put a tax onto, not Coca-Cola, but onto soda specifically. And in light of that, the Mexican manufacturers, who until that point had been quite happy with cane sugar, said, okay, well then we're going to switch to corn syrup, as the US has done, except for the stuff that we're going to manufacture, and we're going to sell it back to the Americans as Coca-Cola nostalgia. So if you want to buy Coke with cane sugar, you can buy it in the USA, as sold across the Mexican border, but if you're living in Mexico, you now can't buy it. It's now the stuff that's been made with corn syrup. So there's kind of this weird dynamic of what's happened with the politics of that as well. And it's no weirder actually in the UK. This is a massive beet sugar refinery plant. I think it's in East Anglia, where a lot of this is based. And for quite a long time as well, the UK was reliant on cane sugar or cane for its sugar production. In about 1747, I think, they started looking towards beetroot and beets to start producing their sugar instead. And this was at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, when there were kind of trade embargoes and what could be shipped in. So it looked like, well, if we have to produce sugar, we're going to have to do it on our own ground. Well, what can we use? We can use beets. It's kind of that's what we can grow here. We can't grow cane. And so this kind of developed until around the First World War as well, where, again, kind of German U-boats started sinking supply ships. Sugar was seen as very important, and so the government started supporting the growth of beets to turn into sugar for the UK. And so in the UK, you've got this very kind of heroic story about, beets and sugar as this very localized form of production. It saved the farmers. But what's very rarely talked about is the other reason why production shifted to beets over cane, which was that in the colonies, as an empire, the UK actually relied on a huge amount of slave labor to produce its own cane sugar. And once that started to fall away, and once people actually started to have to be paid to produce cane sugar, suddenly it became too expensive. Labor costs were too high, beets were cheaper. But this is kind of this invisible history of sugar, of how it comes into being. If we're talking about labor and manufacturing, it's kind of critical at this point to talk about the manufacturing that's the boom, I guess, that's been happening in China, certainly for the past couple of decades, and particularly thinking about the technologies that come with it as well. One of the arguments that got made about this idea of fair trade, particularly thinking of recent residencies that have happened here as well, is what fair trade technologies look like as well, particularly when you're dealing with both the labour practices that go into developing it, but also the raw materials as well. And a lot of this often feeds back to China, where a lot of this stuff is now starting to happen. And again, it's not just about raw materials, but it's as much about politics of the supply chain as what feeds through as well. So Foxconn is one of the factories and the suppliers that gets most cited and also most known and thought about in terms of where electronics are produced. And they actually started in the US, and they got their first contract, I think, with Atari back in the 80s, and they were producing part of the cabling that went between the console. And they were doing fairly high turnover at that stage as gaming consoles got more and more popular. And in 1987, they moved their manufacturing plants over to China, and they were the first ones to do so. And they set up in Shenzhen, which is now one of the the major manufacturing hubs of China itself. So things started to roll along. More capabilities were built up in China around manufacturing itself. Once Hong Kong itself was handed back to China from Great Britain in '97, that set it up as this interesting hub into mainland China itself. And Shenzhen, as a city, as a region, is very nearby to Hong Kong. And I think in the past 2 years, the first time Chinese manufacturing capabilities overtook the US for the first time. And this is kind of a big deal for thinking about where things come from, where they are and what you see and what you don't see. So it's not as simple as this is where all the manufacturing is and it is, and the world is shifting. A lot of manufacturing happens in China, but it is mostly at the slightly cheaper end of the market. So we're talking about textiles, we're talking about clothes, we are talking about some electronics, but it's not the kind of massive industrial machinery or necessarily medical or scientific machinery. That stuff is still predominantly produced in the US. But there is a thing that China itself provides cheaper labor, it provides increased manufacturing skills itself, but it's still, for all of that, it's still mostly owned by foreign-owned firms. So it's still this this complex, this chewing apart of where the ownership is and where the actual means of production is actually happening itself. Now this is a Chinese manufacturing plant. It's one that normally makes, we think, either kettles or rice cookers. You can see them on the back wall here. What's been done at the moment, though, is it's been taken over by a pair of artists, Cohen and Van Balen, who have produced a piece called 75 Watt, which is currently up at FACT in Liverpool. And for this, they designed an object, that this white thing that you can see moving down the production line here, that looks halfway between a hairdryer and a stormtrooper helmet. It's this white clunky thing that doesn't seem to do any much. And the reason is it doesn't do anything. The only purpose of this device is to make the people on the production line who are producing it do a dance as they go through the means of production. So it's this really lovely piece that looks at and thinks about what actually mass manufacturing is, what is actually happening on the ground with these forms of production as they go on in places that might not necessarily be so very visible to the people who are actually consuming their products. Is there any relationship between how we see the physical artifact of what we get and the form of labour, of work that took place to actually get it to that point as well? But there's other interesting political things around the Chinese and manufacturing as well. Now this was the picture I showed you before. It's a factory, it's not in Shenzhen, it's slightly outside of that region. It's fairly massive. It's set up in '93. It produces over 3,000 pieces of stock So it's got fairly specific capabilities. You know, it can produce a lot of different things according to what's needed. It has its own internal R&D team. It has its own marketing team. And it is one of the companies which is responsible for the sex toy industry as well. And I love this because, again, if you look kind of at the production technique, there's nothing here that really tells you what's going on in the same way, you know, there's the Conan Van Balen piece. It's a factory line. Things are being made. But then you've got the showroom, which is astonishingly lurid and bright pink. And this is kind of a really fascinating thing. It's not just that China has the manufacturing capabilities at the moment to produce this kind of stuff. The way that sexuality is regulated in China is really fascinating as well. Pornography itself online is pretty much outlawed. There's been a big crackdown in the past 10 years or so that's been taking out not only kind of websites, social networks, but audiobooks and video chat rooms as well. So all of that is, you know, is illegal, is theoretically off the table, although it's reasonably easy to access. But on the other hand, there's this manufacturing capability that's going into kind of other forms of production that are still massively sexualized. And again, these are not abstract objects. If you look at the boxes for what these are, if you look at them, they're fairly graphic, they're fairly visceral, they're kind of obvious in what they are. I'm kind of glad that photo is slightly fuzzy. It's, you know, they're astonishing things which are being made in this factory, and 3,000 things are being made here as well. And so that kind of part of it's fascinating, but it's also how it's being marketed as well. And it's not just being sold around sexuality, it's being marketed as a form of health, that this is kind of a legitimate thing because it's a form of sexual health and social health and personal health, and that makes it okay. So it's not just about bodies, it's about these objects as well that can be used, you know, drawing on this manufacturing capability that's been developing for the past 20, 30 years or so. And there's kind of this weird tension in this space that Katrine Jacobs, who's an academic who's been working on this area for a while, describes as kind of the government which denounces pleasure industries while also cultivating them as a form of capitalist expansion. So you can work in these places, you can make these things, but they're only acceptable in certain ways as well. It's also, there's kind of a nice little thing here that although a lot of the ownership of these companies is still, again, foreign owned, you know, these are overseas markets, there's more kind of internal sales going on as well. There's kind of increasing luxury markets in China. So it's really interesting to think about what the next 10 years looks like in this space too. But we were saying that things kind of, they're visible while they work. They're invisible while they work, and they start to become visible when they fall apart. So one of the starting points that when I kind of started chewing over supply chains, I became moderately obsessed with was what happens when they fall apart. I mean, not just what happens when one Maersk ship kind of crashes into Devon and everyone gets massively overexcited about motorbikes. What happens if there are bigger things happening here as well? This is a photo from Brighton, the Brighton Sea. Many of you probably saw it when it happened in January. This is the floods, basically. This is what happens when the pebbles got washed up. And the kind of the weather conditions, the kind of the precursors, the trailer, I think as someone described it, for climate change, the kind of the changing, strange weather, extreme weather conditions, is kind of a warm-up for what might happen and how this might start to affect logistics and supply chains. And I became moderately obsessed with this for a while. If you remember when the volcano went up in Iceland a few years ago, and there was no flying, and there was a lot of talk about kind of food scarcity and food resilience, and how long would you last if there was only so much food in Brighton? If how long could you cope with once the train lines go down? It raises questions more than food, but about everything else as well. The logistics stuff that I mentioned at the very beginning is massively infrastructure dependent. It depends on energy, it depends on fuel, it depends on water. The production techniques depend on all these things as well. What happens when they start to fall apart, if they will? There are slightly kind of terrifying surveys that have been done by consultancy firms for manufacturers, for large companies, that have said, when do you think the effects of climate change are going to start to kick in on your companies, and what kind of effects do you think they have? And the response have generally come back saying, there will be, the effects on production, whether we can do that, whether we can get access to things. There'll be effects on kind of whether we can sell things, how we get things out there as well. And the question of, well, when do you think this is going to happen? And a lot of people said it's kind of happening now, or at least in the next 5 years. So the question is, well, what then? You know, one of the things that Thomas Thwaites with his Toaster project talked about was that it's not a kind of romanticizing of the past. You know, one of the points here is that you can't go back. You can't go back to a pre-industrial era. We are where we are now. We have these dependencies set up. So what do you do next? How do you start to kind of build resilience into these systems themselves? Do you start to kind of try and figure out what resources you've got locally and try to use them better? Do you try and shift what you're actually making so it's more dependable? Do you try and kind of figure out how do you create a more localized system of production, if that's what it is? And these are kind of massive and fairly horrible and hairy questions, and there's a lot of people doing work in this area. But one of the kind of the things that started kind of rising up, and that also bit me a bit, partly because it seemed so bloody ridiculous, was at the point where people started talking about, well, what happens if 3D printing will save us? Because look, it'll be brilliant. You can print out what you need. We don't need to be anywhere else. It'll be fantastic. These are kind of dolls that are made by a London company called Makeys. They are 3D printed, by which we mean we have 3D modeling technology plus additive and subtractive fabrication techniques, which means that they are essentially, you can print them, but they are also modifiable as well. In the kind of the land rush around 3D printing, they've been kind of held up as this, and it's a lovely company and they do kind of really fascinating things, but the bigger idea of 3D printing has been held up as this kind of this new mode of manufacturing, the new future that will come. I was in a talk about 3D printing a few summers ago when the London riots were happening, and one of the speakers said, well, if everyone just had 3D printers, it would be fine, there wouldn't be any riots, people would just print those trainers, they wouldn't steal them. And it's like, when things wash up on the shore, there's scaffolds, people will try and take things. If you have, a means of producing something, there's a bigger system around them as well. One of the things about trying to build resilience into a system is not just giving someone a shiny thing, a 3D printer saying, go forth and do things, but actually looking at the bigger system around it. Do people know how to operate it? Is the government going to work with this? What is the bigger system of production? So 3D printing is kind of this weird kind of future fantasy of what might be. And a lot of the kind of hype around it has been around exactly this thing of mass customization. You can make anything you want to, like anything you want to, and it'll be brilliant, like trainers or all manner of fantastic things. There's kind of a vague deviant object aspect of it as well, which makes me quite stroppy, but is worth mentioning. The idea of the 3D printed gun of, anyone can print anything, and that, those might be terrible things. But one of the things that's more interesting for me about this is more what happens when you can start to produce things anywhere, not anything, any type of thing, but anywhere. If you can actually kind of cut out this massive chunk of a supply chain and slam straight into this thing where you are making a thing right now. What does that look like? And again, it feels like what we've got here are more conversations than realities. There's a huge amount of research being done in this area that's kind of still that kind of R&D, blue skies kind of thing of what might be, what could you do? And a lot of it's really shiny gadget focused. A lot of it doesn't look at the kind of the bigger, messier system that we've been thinking about. What happens when these things get bought? What does copyright look like? How do you kind of manage the access to the printing supplies? In the talk about the London riots, someone said, after this comment was made about printing trainers, someone said, well, people won't steal trainers, but they will steal the things that you use for printing the trainers. You take the raw materials. So what do those bigger systems look like themselves? And one of the areas where this is kind of interesting is around healthcare. So there's been a really long history of mass customization in healthcare for as long as medicine's been going on. This is a cast that's been printed by someone, and it's a beautiful thing, this idea that if you break or fracture your arm, you can scan it, and then you can print out a cast that exactly fits where the break is. You don't have to have that thing of it being wrapped up and dependent on the kind of the feeble and limited capabilities of a human. You can outsource it all to this fantastic program that will do it for you. So there's been a lot, but there's been a longer history of people making their own medical devices because human bodies are weird and they're individual, and what works for one single person who's that big won't work for another person who's another shape. As people have discovered new forms of illness or disease or just new modes of treatment, they started making new things. And doctors themselves have been doing it for years. I mean, this is kind of a slightly horrifying speculum that, again, doctor manufactured this way of thinking about, well, what do we need to do? How can we make this? And again, it's kind of been inhibited by regulation in the same research that we did around the mining equipment, we talked to a bunch of doctors as well to talk about how they made devices. And one of the things they were saying was, previously, in times gone by, when it was all fields and it was brilliant, if you wanted to make something, a bit of kit to test out, you could go down the corridor in your hospital and you could go to the engineering plant and you could ask them, can you make me this widget? And the person in engineering would say, brilliant, yep. They'd make it for you, you take it back that afternoon and you use it on a patient. Now it has to be, and they said this was kind of a sad face, now it has to be, tested, it has to go through health and safety, you can't just make a thing and use it on a patient because, my God, what is medicine for anymore? But there's a very long history of people doing this stuff. And there's a particularly long history around this, around sexual health. They're around, forms of contraception, around forms of reproduction, around also forms of kind of safety as well. There's this kind of this constant thing where there's a very local need for it. One of the things that really struck me, and this is kind of where a lot of this started, with both the flooding but also with the volcano, was when supply chains break down, how do people get their medicine? How much do you have stocked up? Where do you start to kind of stockpile this stuff? How much can you actually locally produce as well? So this kind of brings us back to Chekhov's contraception. And this is a little intrauterine device that was made by a designer, I think in the last year. And he offered it up as a kind of as a political concept, not as a thing to be really used. And he had to, once he'd kind of released it into the world, he said, no, really, I know that I've put the designs for this up on GitHub, but please don't use it medically. Don't. It's an idea, it's not a thing that's meant to be used. And this idea that he had was meant to raise awareness around basically how expensive contraception is and how you might kind of lower costs by allowing people to print it, but also how with open design you could find a way to open it up as well and show how it could be modifiable, so made for lots of different types of bodies. When it came out, there was this kind of prickling on the back of my neck, and I saw lots of people reacting to it in kind of interesting ways, because it is a provocation piece. It's not dissimilar to a 3D printed gun. It's in the sense that it doesn't necessarily work, but it's there to make you start thinking about it and talking about it, and then when you've had a drink in the pub, talking about it a bit more and getting a bit angrier about it. But what it is it's kind of, again, the shiny object idea, this thing of, here's the shiny thing, and we kind of abstract away from what the production techniques are, but it's a shiny thing that offers you a way of just simply offering, a solution. And actually, sexual health and all healthcare is a bit more bloody complicated than just a single thing. If you're going to any kind of health clinic, you're probably going to have, firstly, the physical space, the professional space of it as well. You've got beds, you've got stirrups, you've got various forms of, sanitizing things, you've got rubber gloves, you've got lots of other bits of kit as well, you've got, cotton buds, all the kind of the variant that comes with medical treatment that isn't just one single object, that form part of this richer network of what it means to do this thing. And it's also massively personalized as well. This is a photo in one of the Brighton clinics, which to kind of help people to calm down from what might be quite a nervous-making thing. They've got lots of pictures they've just dragged from everywhere. So they've got their Batman logo. They've got a picture of the Eden Project. They've got a picture of a cat that I think someone's daughter drew. So if you're feeling a bit nervous, you could go and look at that as well. So there's kind of this big social system and this social life that goes around actually these quite small devices as well. So this, to kind of wind up, is where we're going with our research at the moment. We've been awarded Nesta funding to look at kind of what some kind of futures might be around digital fabrication. So this kind of the Chekhov's contraceptive, the 3D printed thing, but also with broader healthcare itself. What's it look like when you start to bring these techniques into sexual healthcare? What does it look like when you start to abstract back, not just from the individual, not just from the kind of the clinic, but to the wider network of supply and demand as well? How does what does it look like at a kind of a practical level if you actually made it, rather than just offering up as a single thing, as a kind of a technological gimme to say, there you go, and that's it. So this is what we're going to be doing for the next few months. It's interesting and exciting and slightly terrifying in its own kind of special way, but it's something that, like I said, it started with conversations about shipping containers. Brilliant. What are they all about? And ended up in actually quite an unusual place in clinics in northern Brighton. So to conclude with this, like I said, for me, the kind of the obsession, I think, with supply chains and logistics kind of comes from a part, it's anti-individualistic. It doesn't let you be a single person. It doesn't let a single object be a single object, but it shows you how, as a person, you exist in this really rich and messy and interconnected, but also invisible network where the actions that you take and the things that you buy and the modes of production aren't necessarily always visible to see, but they're there and they're rumbling along under the surface, and they're massively physical and they're massively fallible as well. You know, this little thing might be at any stage about to, you know, tip over and do terrible things. You know, it's not, you know, it's this whole kind of curious but so hidden network of what it looks like. And the academics who were kind of doing the research on sugar that I cited earlier, they talked about how for them, thinking about atomized spaces, you can't do that if you're trying to think about technology, if you're trying to think about forms of production. There's an anthropologist called Anna Singh who says, you know, don't look at the object, don't make the object the unit of analysis, don't look at the shiny thing, don't look at the IED, don't look at the phone, don't look at the sex toy, don't even look at the shipping container. Look at the scale as being the unit of analysis. Look at what it is. Look at how these processes are simultaneously local and global and how those things lock in together at the same time. And then you might have to start to have some sense of what is actually going on. Thank you.
I think we've got 15 minutes for some questions. Would you like to do one? Do you want something?
Yeah. If you're going to do a Q&A, are you going to?
I should grab my shiny phone.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask before I put my question to Georgina? Okay, I'll start then. So you covered both the sort of very grassroots level manufacturing, the kind of the hobbyists with the 3D printer, and obviously the huge global scale Chinese manufacturing. Yep. And we all know that those two things are going in different trajectories. Or certainly with the Chinese manufacturing, we know it's all being increasingly constrained by rising fuel costs and rising aspirations in China, rightly so. And we believe, there's certainly a lot of hype that the grassroots manufacturing, the 3D printing and so on, is rising up. But it feels like the grassroots manufacturing is rising up at quite a slow pace, and the global Chinese manufacturing is potentially at threat of falling off quite a significant cliff at some point in the future. And there's maybe a dangerous gap between those two things, a slightly terrifying gap. And I wonder if you could make any predictions about how that might play out.
Probably not at this point specifically. It feels like they're not things that are necessarily locked into each other particularly. They're still, with large-scale manufacturing, there's still enough kind of evenness in the system for it to be working out reasonably. One of the things I didn't mention, which I think we talked about before, was the rare earth minerals, the control of those that have been coming from China as well, from the control about exports. So these things that are needed desperately for particularly for electronics manufacture. That kind of controls had come into place certainly, I think, since 2009 that may now have fallen off, that were preventing these things from being exported. And the case that was being made was it was an environmental case, that these things, they couldn't mine too much. One of the critiques of that was that possibly it was actually a way for kind of that form of Asian manufacturing economies to kind of actually jump up the supply chain and try and lock, rather than just exporting raw materials, to actually use them themselves and move a few steps up the supply chain. There's still that kind of stuff that's yet to come. It's still, like I said, it's still not quite at the capabilities that there have been in other spaces as well. But I'm not sure that I can make massive predictions about anything falling off a cliff in that particular way. It's you've got fairly rooted structures that are kind of, even if they're shaky, they're quite solid there. And again, I'm really nervous, and I say this, the hype around the localized manufacturing at the moment makes me nervous, but feels a little too close to being it's a shiny thing and it's a local story and it's a hero story, and there's not enough analysis of, well, what is this? Is this just another gadget-driven thing? How does this lock into other systems itself? And that there's hype as rocket fuel, and there's hype as kind of driving on fumes. You know,
there's a sort of David and Goliath feeling to it, which is very appealing and makes for a nice story.
It's a lovely story. It's the kind of thing that you'd exactly expect to see up on the posters, you know, when you're coming through Heathrow of, you know, Britain is great, innovation is great, 3D manufacturing is great, and, you know, photo of someone, you know, locally with their maker bot looking very happy. Yes. And that's not necessarily the same as something which is specifically contributing to GDP or doing anything else itself. So I kind of, the hype part of it kind of is the bit where I start to get quite nervous about it. So, yeah, that's possibly not as cheerful.
Okay, I couldn't get you to commit to a prediction there, but that's fair enough. Would anyone else like to, Jeremy?
A couple of years ago, I was at a digital technology conference, and there was a guy talking about shipping containers, and specifically he was talking about what the physical networks could learn from digital networks. He was there to kind of that one of the inefficiencies with shipping containers is that an empty shipping container takes up as much space as a full one. And he's designed a collapsible one, he's pretty smart. So he was kind of looking to us, as you know, Fred said, how to affect the physical networks. He was pointing out things like these ridiculous, old-fashioned things that come with physical networks, like companies want their stuff to be in their shipping container, the one with their logo on it. So they will ship empty containers across the ocean just to fill them up again so that they're in their shipping container that has their logo, and then ship them back to where they were to begin with. You know, just ridiculous inefficiencies. But it strikes me that people aren't looking at where they could make those little tweaks that would make those networks so much more efficient because of the scale that we're talking about. And instead, people are more focused on what seems to be more like the year zero thing, like, well, we'll throw it all away and start 3D printing, and it'll all be local. That it's maybe not as sexy to look at the incremental changes you could make that could have actually big effects because of the scale.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the piece, I think the stuff I was citing very early came from a bit of consultancy I did with the EU a few years ago on service innovation and logistics, which is so far from being sexy, but it was so interesting. This absolute crash, it really was this crash course between, you know, these very old school, very established forms of shipping and kind of very slowly, very carefully bringing in these digital technologies, which means that you can map things and track things, but oh God, what that meant to bring it into that type of company. And you know, the fact that this word agile we used that in the report just made me kind of, again, just go, oh, I don't even know if that's, are you using that in that way? Do you know what that means? Is this what this is? Like, what does agile mean in a ship that size? But I quite like that it was those little kind of things that, you know, because you can't, well, I mean, you can throw it all out, but it kind of, it doesn't work. You know, it ends up in these kind of post-apocalyptic fantasy scenarios where actually no one is the hero, no one wins, you just have nothing. So there's still these networks and these massive rooted infrastructures to play with, but what kind of little shifts around the edges can you do to start, you know, gently trying to make something different?
Anyone else like to ask? Amy?
I'm just sort of quite interested in your ideas about resilience. So listening to you sort of on the, you know, at one level, you're saying this whole sort of system is so prone to all sorts of, you know, things coming to hit it, big waves, just being one of them. But are you suggesting, or what do you think about the whole sort of idea of bringing things more local? Is that necessarily going to increase resilience, or is it in itself going to open up more vulnerabilities? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are and how far you've got along thinking about that sort of thing.
So I think with that, and again, I'm kind of not as deep in the resilience fields. I know that some people certainly in this space certainly are. My sense of it is it's not just about a specific local form of, you know, we bring things local and that makes everything better, wave magic wand, everyone is happy, but it's more about looking at the specific context of how things work. So, let me go. Example from contraception, actually, which again I didn't mention. Resilience has kind of actually been built into contraception production for quite a long time, and there's this idea of making it local, partly out of sheer necessity, so that if you want to get access to forms of sexual health products, you can do them quite quickly. So that doesn't just mean building them locally, it means building factories locally which are specifically built around local capabilities and local needs as well. So it's not just that you've got this factory nearby to you and that's brilliant. It's about making sure that what is built is working with the skills of people nearby, that it's working with simple technologies, that in the governance system that you've got, that it fits into that kind of place, that you're not just supplanting some kind of new technology, that you're actually bringing in, or possibly working across different organisations to make sure that what you're developing is the appropriate solution for that space. So there's kind of partly a necessity aspect of this as well, and there is a danger about it in the things I was mentioning about supply chains and logistics. Obviously there's a massive, massive danger where a single node of production gets taken out as opposed to multiple nodes of production. But the idea of kind of locality broadly draws on the idea that you can make sure that what you've got works for that specific region itself, and it starts to cut out dependencies further along the chain itself. There's still obviously elements of danger around that you're trying to build up kind of, again, links between the system as well, but it's a way of trying to make sure that each kind of, there are regional strengths that can be drawn on, which you already have to a certain extent with kind of national systems of innovation, that certain regions draw on things that they're very, very good at. But this is the thing about explicitly identifying what space, what economic structures are in place, what governance systems are in place, what forms of knowledge and skills are in place, what are the local natural resources, kind of like the sugar story. What can you already do, and how can you play on those to get to draw the greatest strength out of that space, rather than just implanting something and saying there it is and there we go. So is that?
Yeah. No, I think absolutely. My sort of interest is that actually, if you looked at it in a way, these huge logistical systems in themselves need an infrastructure which can then be used for other things as well. So in a way, the infrastructure that is needed in order to support these logistical systems is a means of creating resilience in
absolutely. So there's kind of that networked aspect of the structure, so that even if points are taken out, you still have that as well. But I guess, yeah, so there's that sitting on top of almost the more physical aspects of what can you have, like actually, space. When I say space is real, that's possibly not helpful, but you know what I mean, material objects and so forth. Yeah. I
think you touched at points on the humans in this infrastructure, and I'm fascinated by the role of the human beings in the manufacturing process, because we see so little of it, and we hear about scare stories at Foxconn and so on, and I think we like to sort of put our hands over our ears. But I was in the context of resilience, that humans can often be the cause of significant step changes in resilience, or particularly drops, generally when they die. So we talk about global trends like fuel prices, for example. I was thinking about the example I'm thinking of is David Hyatt, who had the very successful clothing brand Howie's, who then went on to start a very expensive jeans brand called Hyatt Denim. He's from a place in Wales called Cardigan, where apparently they made jeans many years ago, back when jeans were made in the UK. And he decided to make his jeans in Cardigan. This is the story he tells. He's an ex-ad man, so he tells a very good story, of course. And he found this local workforce of people who used to make jeans 30 years ago, and now were probably close to retirement. Maybe they were already retired. And had he not employed them and started a factory in Cardigan making jeans, this is the story, they would have eventually died out, and there would be no more jeans expertise in Cardigan. And that would have been the end. It would have been impossible, maybe not impossible, but very difficult to revive that industry in that place. So it feels like those are really fragile points, that the human beings may be the most fragile points in that place.
There's certainly something about kind of the tacit and embedded knowledge in these systems as well, about how, we hear of kind of languages dying out, but also kind of skills capabilities going as well. I think that feels like the cardigan/jeans story feels like a really interesting one, because it's quite specific, and it's quite kept in that space, and it's quite embedded in the knowledge of what people have, and there hasn't been. I'm interested in the fact that he felt that if he hadn't employed them, it would have died out, rather than letting them kind of sit into their pensions and have a nice life with a bit of whiskey and the Telegraph, and actually just got someone in to talk to tell them how to make genes instead. But kind of where that kind of transition stuff starts to come through as well. I mean, this kind of also feeds into bigger questions about kind of automation of systems as well. But where that specific craft knowledge is and where that starts to fall apart is curious, I think.
I think we've got time for a short question, if there's one question remaining. Okay, cool. Well, let's wrap it up. Thank you all very much for coming down tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. And can we just have a round of applause to say thanks to Georgina?